Let's begin this morning by just reading what we've already uh, studied, and we'll add a couple of verses onto it today, this morning. Chapter 7, verse 1. Or do you not know, brethren, for I speak to those who know the law, that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives? For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she is released from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband lives she marries another man, she will be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she has married another man. Therefore, my brethren, you also have become dead to the law through the body of Christ, that you may be married to another, to him who was raised from the dead, that we should bear fruit to God. For when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit to death. But now we have been delivered from the law, having died to what we were held by, so that we should serve in the newness of the Spirit, and not in the oldness of the letter. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. But sin, taking opportunity by the commandment, produced in me all manner of evil desires. For apart from the law, sin was dead. Verses 7 and 8 are extremely complicated, and we'll see if we can't work through those this morning. But first, if a person just read Romans chapter 7 in and of itself, he would come to some very wrong conclusions, and that's why we have this great argument in the church concerning, was Paul a Christian or not? That seems to be the main concern of Romans chapter 7. Was Paul is he talking about himself as a Christian or a non-believer? And we will find as we go through this that question is not even important. It doesn't matter. So we must put Romans 7 in context of the book of Romans, what Paul's about. And here is the thing, and remember that you and I have had 2,000 years of teaching concerning this book that the people who read Paul's letter, the people in Rome, didn't have. And so Paul makes some outlandish statements, some absolutely outlandish statements. And without the 2,000 years of history, you and I, we know something about this book. But if you can imagine those people in Rome reading this letter that Paul wrote, and one of the things he says, and this is at the end of chapter 5, verse 20, that the law came in that sin might abound. Doesn't sound good for the law. Where sin abounds, grace does much more abound. Now, he's got to deal with that. He can't let that just hang out there in the air. Naturally, we would step back. If we just heard that, we would step back and say, well, good night. There's no law. Where sin is, the law causes us to sin. And where sin is, grace abounds. And where the sin is like a great rainstorm, grace comes in like a flood. Paul even makes up a word there. He even makes up a word. Where sin abounds, grace does much more abound. That much more is not even in the Greek language in and of itself. It's a brand new word. So that's an outlandish statement. So Paul's got to deal with that. In Romans chapter 5, verse 20 and 21, he's got to deal with that subject. Well, the question then is, well, then let's sin so that grace can increase. The more we sin, the more grace we have, then by all rights, let's sin. And that's what the little man on the side of the page that I've told you about before asked. When you read the book of Romans, you always read it, the first 8 chapters anyway. Actually, the first 11 chapters. You read it with this idea of this little man, this little antagonist on the side of the page that's asking Paul questions. Paul makes a statement, the little man comes back with an argument, and then Paul answers the argument. So Paul says, where sin abound, grace is much more abound. The little man says, well, then let's just sin that grace can increase. The more we sin, the more grace we get. Paul says, perish the thought. God forbid. Don't think like that. And then in chapter 6, the first 11 verses, he shows us the impossibility of that. That can't happen. Okay, and we're not there. That's not our lesson this morning. So now, in Romans 6:14, good morning. In Romans 6:14, he makes another one of these outlandish statements. Okay? What's your problem?
I had a tour. I got a 13-year-old daughter. I need to pay somebody. I can until Thursday. I get paid. I'm broke.
Yeah, you're on your way to work, though. That's the problem. Here.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Right, welcome. That's not Christian charity. What I've got to say is worth $20. Okay, I want to get to this. This is good.
You did that for selfish.
I did. Now, Paul makes this other outlandish statement in Romans 6, verse 14. Sin will not have dominion over you because you're not under law, but under grace. Where sin abounds, grace does much more abound. And sin will not have dominion over you because you're not under law, but under grace. Two things. It seems that Paul is really putting down the law. I mean, if we just read it like any other book, that's what you got to come up with. In his mind, he's got to deal with that. Sin will not have dominion over you because you're not under law, but under grace. Well, then shall we sin? Continue to sin, shall we sin because we're not under law, but under grace? I don't know why Bob's not here. The two of you steal my lessons every week. Yes, Charles, that's 100% correct. In the thinking of Romans, in our subject this morning is 100% correct. Not 99%.
So the more we realize our self-consciousness of sin, the more the grace works in our lives. But it doesn't call me necessarily as a child of God to sin more, but I realize more and more that I need to cross.
Well, we'll look at that. Yeah, we're going to look at that. But yeah, you're right on. What Charles said is absolutely true. Certainly.
In the first part of 7, it says, "For I speak to them that know
The law.
We talked about that a little bit before.
Mhm.
Everybody knows the law. But the fact is, when you get very specific, how many laws have we ever seen in the known history of the human race that said, "Thou shalt not covet"?
Okay. That first statement there, I talked to you that know the law in verse 1 of chapter 7. We have to discuss that. That is talking about the law of the land. Those of you who are Americans, you know what the law is. But from that point on, especially this morning and through these verses 5, 6, 7, and 8, he's clearly talking about the 10 commandments. And in 7 and 8, he's talking about the 10th commandment. And the reason he couldn't have done better. The reason he brings up the 10th commandment is because if he brought up thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder. Well, none of us have done that, so we lose the effect of the law. Thou shalt not steal. We lose the effect because we're thinking outwardly, and now I'm getting ahead of myself. But nevertheless, but thou shalt not covet is something that's done inwardly. You can't, that. I'll tell you how bad it is. I'll tell you how desperate it is, and tell you how powerful that 10th commandment is. It's so powerful, and now I am getting ahead of myself, but I think I'll have time to go back and get through this. It is so powerful that the Roman Catholic Church says, first of all, that at your baptism, you are freed, you're loosened from your the sin of Adam. You're no longer have that Adamic nature. The water takes that away. And then secondly, you do not, and this is so contrary, not only to Matthew chapter 5, what Jesus said, but what Paul is saying about himself right here, as we'll get to it, is that the Catholic Church says, now, you're no longer, you don't have the Adamic nature, but it is not sin to desire sin. The only sin there is your actions because of that 10th commandment. They're absolutely They have no understanding whatsoever of the 10th commandment. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's oxen or his ass. Thou shalt not covet anything that thy neighbor has. So when Paul brings up the covetousness here in verse 7 and 8, he's at the very heart of human sinfulness. And our lesson this morning is about sin. Us good grace teachers, we never communicate how awful sin is. Paul takes the time this morning to discuss how awful sin is, and so we will too. But do you see how the Catholics get around that? Now, they're not the only ones that get around it. All of the so-called Protestant evangelical churches that teach sinless perfection, they do the exact same thing. It's what you do is sin, and you can come to a place where you no longer practice sin. But to desire sin, to think, to have a heart of sin, that's okay, as long as you don't carry it out. Now I'll tell you a story. And like I say, I'm getting toward the end rather than at the beginning, but we're going to get to all this. About Mr. Harry Ironside. I have to tell you 3 stories, just to kind of let you get to know him a little bit. The first story is he was on a train. This was probably 50, 60, 70 years ago. He was on a train from Denver to San Francisco, and there weren't a lot of people in his car, but there were these 3 nuns. And he got to know them, and they got to talking, and he was reading his Bible, and they came over and asked him about himself, and they asked him what his name was. He said, "My name's Saint Harry." "Oh, you're a saint?" "Yes, I'm a saint." And he said, "Well, I see you're reading your Bible. What do you belong to? What do you think about the Bible?" He said, "Oh, I'm a Catholic priest." And so here's Saint Harry, a Catholic priest, and these nuns get to meet him and know him, and it was wonderful. So they went throughout the whole car telling everybody that man over there is a saint, and he's a Catholic priest, which was all true. And so eventually they came back, and he got to explain himself to these ladies. We don't know the result of that, but nevertheless, he took them to the scriptures and showed them, and in doing so, gave them the gospel that he was Saint Harry, a Catholic priest. Now that he didn't say Roman Catholic. Yeah. Second little story is that this is after the story that I want to hone in on. But he was, I believe, and I'm not sure about this, but I believe he was one of the founders of Dallas Theological Seminary. If he wasn't, but I do know for a fact that he was their preacher at large. Well, after a few years of being open, Dallas Theological had so much financial problems that they decided that they had to come to a point of closing. And the point of closing was at 2 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon of 19 whatever. At 2 o'clock, if they didn't get it substantial amount of money in, $30,000, this would have been 40 years ago, I guess, 50. If they did not get $30,000, they were going to close, they were going to shut down the school. They were going to shut the school down at 2 o'clock. And so Mr. Schaefer and Mr. Schofield and Mr. Ironside and others in the staff all met in Mr. Schaefer's office for prayer. They started at 11 o'clock, and they were going to pray until 2 o'clock, that they would receive money enough that the doors would stay open. And Mr. Ironside was known at this time. He was known for his very down-to-earth, that's kind of a bad term, isn't it? But nevertheless, his practical, down-to-earth prayers. People enjoyed listening to him because he was so practical as he prayed. So they're praying, everybody's praying around and around and around and around. Finally, Mr. Ironside says, "Father, you own the cattle on 1,000 hills. Go sell some of them and give us the money." Mr. Schaefer had given instructions to his secretary, that absolutely under no circumstance should they be interrupted, because they are praying for this $30,000. If they don't get it by 2 o'clock, the school's going to close. We don't want to talk to anyone. We're just going to pray. A man came to the office and talked to the secretary. Said, "I want to speak to the president. I want to speak to the head man here." And she said, I'm sorry, he's in prayer. He cannot be disturbed. I've been given strict instructions. He said, I've got a check here for $30,000 and I want to give it to him. And so she goes in to where they're praying and she gets Mr. Schaefer. He says, I told you we do not want to be disturbed. She said, you've got to come out, talk to this man. He's got a check. So he goes out of the prayer group, out into the office, and there is this man. He says, you know, I don't know anything about Dallas Theological Seminary. I don't know anything about the school. I don't know anything about you guys. But I live in Abilene, and I was up in Fort Worth, and I just sold all my stock at the Fort Worth packing town. And on my way back to Abilene, I just had this strong desire, this strong need to come by here and give you this check for $30,000. And Mr. Schaefer said, well, thank you very much. He went back into where they were praying, and he said, Harry, God sold the cattle. It's a good story. Well, okay, here's the thing. Harry Ironside came up through the Salvation Army. And the Salvation Army is really, really big on this sinless perfection. And so because of this, they have homes all over the country, or used to have homes all over the country. They probably don't believe anything now, I don't know. But back then, they were fundamental. And they had homes all over the country for all their people that would go crazy, that would go have nervous breakdowns. Because you're going to have, if you're really serious about this sinless perfection, you're going to have a nervous breakdown. So Harry Ironside had a nervous breakdown, and he went into one of these homes, trying to be perfect. And while he was there, after he was there a few days, he met this wonderful, just wonderful woman who was also there. And he thought to himself, as he got to know her better, and as he talked with her, he got to know her better, he thought, if there's ever anyone who has accomplished sinless perfection, it is this lady. And so one night, he got up out of his bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, put on his robe and his slippers, and he was on his way down to her room because he wanted to talk to her about how she became so perfect, because this was eating at him. Just as he got to his door, there was a knock on the door. He opened the door at 2 o'clock in the morning. He opened the door, and it was this lady, the very lady he was going to see. And there she was in her robe and in her house shoes. And she said, may I come in? He said, yes, come right in. So she came in and she sat down and she says, all my life I have been trying to come to this place of sinless perfection. If there's ever anyone that I've ever known that has achieved it, it's you. Will you please tell me how you did it? So Ironside said, I was just on my way to your room to ask you the very same question. And they both started laughing. The next morning, they both left. And that was the end of Harry's problem. And that was the end of his tenure with the Salvation Army. That is just the point that Paul brings up here of the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet. That's something that there's no action involved. And that's death. That's pure death to anybody. They can't get around that one. Thou shalt not kill. Okay. Or thou shalt not murder. Okay, I haven't murdered. Thou shalt not steal. Well, there's probably folks that have been raised right who haven't stolen. I don't know. But thou shalt not covet, you can't get around that one. We're all there. So maybe that's toward the end of my lesson, but maybe it'll explain what you just said about coveting.
The thing about that, it was the only one that didn't have a penalty associated with it. How would I know that you're coveting?
Right. You couldn't prosecute it. You couldn't prosecute it. But this one is the worst one. Well, I mean, this is the biggie. This is the granddaddy right here. You can't think 5 minutes without breaking the 10th commandment. Okay, so Paul says where sin abounds, grace is much more abound. Then in Romans 6:14 he says, sin shall not have dominion over you, for you're not under the law, but under grace. So two things. He's putting down the law, and he's glorifying the fact that we're not under law and that we're under grace. So let's just throw rocks at the law. So he deals with, in the first 11 verses of Romans 6, he deals with the fact that we not to continue in sin, that grace may abound. And now, in chapter 7, he picks up the part about the law. Now, there's nowhere in all the Bible, even in Galatians, there's nowhere in all the Bible that the teaching of the holy law of God is more prevalent than in Romans chapter 7. So that's what Romans chapter 7 is all about, is about the law of God and how it works on people and and the Christian's position toward it. Now, in the first 4 verses of chapter 7, he talks about we have a totally and completely different standing now. We were married to the law as non-believers, but we died, and now we are, even though it doesn't make quite perfect sense, it's nevertheless absolutely true, that we were married to the law, but now we died, and now we're in the risen Christ, and we're married to Christ. We're married to the Lord Jesus Christ. The law has no more dominion, no more influence, no more power over us, because we died to it. Not only that, but now that we're married to the Lord Jesus Christ, we now can bear fruit to God. The antinomian sits somewhere and reads his Bible and learns the doctrine, but never puts it into practice. That's the difference between an antinomian and a Christian, a right-on mature Christian, is that the mature Christian knows the doctrine, but he also practices Christianity. The antinomian says, I don't need to do anything, just sit here and God is sovereign, I'll be thankful. Doesn't work that way, because we have the power of the Spirit. Now, that's down through verse 4. We bear fruit to God. Now, in verse 5, he gets negative on us again, showing that the law operates according to what motored us as non-believers. And he's showing that you do not live the Christian life. The Christian life is not one that you live just like you live the non-Christian life, only now you live it with morality. Now you live a better standard, a higher standard. That's not the Christian life. You do not live the Christian life the way you lived your non-Christian life, only now you've been reformed. You've now changed. That's not it. Then in verse 6, he tells us that here's how we do live. We do live by the power of the Holy. By the way, living that other way, in verse 5, you do not bear fruit to God, you bear fruit to death. Now, in verse 6, he tells us that, but we live we're married to Christ, we live in the resurrected Christ, and the Holy Spirit now has power in our life, and we live by the Spirit, the power of the Holy Spirit, and not by the letter of the law, or not by the letter of the writings, or not by the 10 Commandments. Verse 7, Paul has to He's laid out a lot of things here that could be very, very controversial and could be very misleading. We don't live by the 10 Commandments. Where sin abound, grace does much more abound because of the law. Sin will not have dominion over you because you're not under law, you're under grace. And so we get the idea. The little man on the side of the page could get the idea. Well, this law is of no consequence whatsoever. Forget the law. Forget the law. Forget the 10 Commandments. It's bad news. It's ineffective. It has no purpose. So let's just get rid of it. And Paul says in verse 7, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? He already said the law produces sin, did he not? On the contrary, perish the thought. Don't think that way. To think that the holy law of God is sin, don't even think that way. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. You say the very same truth by saying, for God so hated sin that he gave his only begotten Son. We have, all cultures, all people have some sort of standard to live by. Paul is not doing away with the standard. Our standard is the holy, holy law of God, found in the 10 Commandments and on down to the rest of them. That's the standard, and you and I know that is the standard for all human beings, wherever they live, whatever it is. It is the 10 Commandments is the standard of God for their behavior. So that is not sin. Now he's going to have to explain this and develop it. Is the law sin? Certainly not. We must have the standard. And anybody who does not have the standard is, I like to say, more evil than those that do, but we're all evil equally. But nevertheless, that's a terrible, awful thing to think, that there is no human standard or that there is no Christian standard. The human standard is the 10 Commandments, and the Christian standard is the 10 Commandments. Certainly not. On the contrary. Now here is what the law, then what purpose is the law? What purpose do we have in the law? And now he's going to tell us what the purpose of the law is. Oh, by the way, he already said he said that the law came in sideways to those people back in chapter 5. The law came in on the side. Turn to Genesis chapter 6 for a moment. This is a description of all mankind back before the flood, and this is the description of all mankind today. There's no difference. Nothing has changed. Verse 5, Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 8 says much the same thing, that he's evil from his youth. That is the condition of man. There was no law. There was no law they were breaking. There were no commandments that they were breaking before God. But that was their condition. They were constantly and continuously in sin and evil. Now, Paul says in verse 7, back in our text, What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. Now, let's don't be silly at this point, as some are, just plain silly. Of course, Paul knew what sin was. Before and after he was a Christian, it makes no difference. Of course he knew. All men know. All men know. They're not convicted as you were or are, but all men everywhere have a general understanding of right and wrong. This is so very important. They have a general understanding of right and wrong, and they practice the wrong and they don't do the right. They have this general understanding. They're not necessarily convicted by it. They're certainly not drawn to Christ by it. But everyone on the planet knows that they could do a better job of living their life, but they're not convicted by it. Paul knew that it makes no difference as a Christian, as a non-Christian, before as a Pharisee, before then or after then. It makes no difference. Paul understood and knows, as you understand and know, that a general understanding and knowledge of sin. I'm not as good as I should be. I'm not as good as I could be. Even in my own strength, I could be better. But that doesn't do any good for anybody. So Paul says, I didn't know sin. I didn't know sin as sin. I didn't know the evilness of sin. I didn't know the awfulness of sin. I didn't know the absolute horribleness of sin toward God until God said, Thou shalt not lust. Now we've honed it down into something that cannot be disguised, that cannot be put away. Thou shalt not lust. Thou shalt not covet. And what that word lust or covet means is thou shalt not lust after anything that's forbidden. Now, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal. The rich young ruler, he was okay with all of that. But here, have you ever lusted after Paul, have you ever lusted after anything that was forbidden to you? And that brought him to his knees. That convicted him. That's what the law is for. It's to show the holiness of God and the sinfulness of man. So no, the law is not sin. The law is not done away with. The law is not of no effect. The law is not a bad thing. The law is a wonderful thing. It's an absolutely wonderful thing in that it shows me my sinfulness, true sinfulness. I don't know that by being a member of the Lions Club. I know that there are members in the Lions Club that are doing more for their community than I am. The members in the Lions Club that have a better life than I do. There are more moral people there than I am. But it does not lead me toward God. It does not lead me toward Christ. It does not convict me of real sin in my life. It just shows that I am not quite as good as this fellow or that lady. And that is just a general knowledge of right and wrong, a general knowledge of morality, and I don't practice the morality that I know. But now God comes in, and that was the case before the flood. They were sinful continuously. The thoughts were evil continuously. But it wasn't until God came in sideways, brought the law in sideways alongside of justification by faith when he said, thou shalt not covet. You shalt not lust after anything that's forbidden. That puts a whole new twist on things. Now I really am a sinful person toward God. And I have a degree of understanding now of what sin really is. That's why Paul says, on the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. Do you buy that? Of course, that my problem here is I'm adding to what Paul's written in the fact that I'm saying that he understood, had a general knowledge, as all men do, of sin. I think we're born with it. We can overcome it through practice. We can continue to sin so much on a particular area that it no longer becomes sin to us. But I think, that we're all born with an understanding of right and wrong of some degree, whether it's from the family, from the culture, from the country, from whatever it may be. But if we practice it long enough, as we've all know, we can finally get over the fact that we're sinning in that way. But you can't get around "thou shalt not covet." You can't get around that. You cannot desire that which is forbidden to you. Have you ever done that? Have you ever done that this morning? That is the holy law of God. And what that will do is it will make you aware. It gives you no out. Every mouth shall be stopped because it gives you no wiggle room to get around God's holy law. Well, you should live as well as you can. Well, there's a lot of wiggle room there. Thou shalt not lust after things that are forbidden. And that's not the end of it. Sin, we are such sinful people. Sin has so much power in our lives that Paul goes on. For I would not have known sin except through the law. Now we know where Paul is. He's a violator. He's a sinner toward God, against God. It's not that he doesn't quite measure up with the rest of the human beings around him, but he is a violator of the holy law of God given by God to him. For I would not have known covetousness. The lust, covetousness is all the same word here. I would not know covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. The law, there's nothing wrong with the law. It's you and your sinfulness. That's the problem. You can raise a child, and you'll never have a problem with that child. You will raise a monster, but all you got to do is say, yes, dear, and never say no, and never give any instructions. And just let that child grow up, and you'll never have a problem with that child until you tell him, don't do that. The minute you tell him don't do that, you're going to have a problem. So we try to tell our children don't do that so that they'll be raised halfway legit. But if we never told them that, we'd never have a problem with them at all. They just think the world of us, but they'd be a monster. What I believe that the text is saying is that it's wrong for you to want something that's forbidden to you. But lust is used in the Bible in a very positive way in some places, and then in a very vanilla way in others. It's just according to context. And then here, of course, in a very damaging way. There are two words here in verse 7, know. There are two different words. One is to know with a mental understanding, and the other is to know by practice. So Paul says, I would not have known sin, have a mindful understanding of sin, except through the law, for I would not have known covetousness. That word known there is by practice. I know it by experience. That's a big difference, isn't it? The things we know by experience and the things that we know just know something about. Unless the law had said, you shalt not covet. And this is what Charles brought up earlier. Don't think of a red-headed baboon. You're going to do it. That's all there is to it. Linda said that I fouled up my story about that book so bad that I didn't even make my point clear. The point I made, the two statements I made was, and we're not going to talk about the book, but the two statements I made was, for a short period of time, it was a glorious time in our marriage by reading this book. It was wonderful. And then I said, but there has been nothing in my married life that has caused me more harm than reading this book. And the reason for that is now I know all the things I should be doing. And I was doing them for a while. But it's just law, law, law. I know all these things that I should be doing, but the law but the law aggravates sin. The sin is aggravated by the law, and it doesn't make you sin less, it makes you sin more. That's the power of the law, but it's where the power of sin is. The power of sin in your life is so powerful that it even uses the holy law of God. You are so evil, and you are so against God in this respect, in your nature, that the sin in your life is so powerful that it can even use and has the power to use the holy law of God to aggravate to cause you to even sin more. Doesn't mean that the law is sin, or that the law is negative, or the law is bad. That's just the way things are. So if you're not under law, then sin cannot have dominion over you. The law's not going to change. The law is always going to be there. But we need to understand that we have died to that law. Even the holy law of God, even to the 10 Commandments. We've died. We're not married to them. We're married to the risen Christ. And there is no law. We do have the standard for human behavior. We have the standard for Christian behavior. It's all through the New Testament. But we're not under that standard. We're not being judged by that standard. It's to help us, not to hurt us. And the key is to put yourself under the law, or being dead to the law. So what is the outcome? What is the bottom line here? What is it that we are to do? We're to reckon ourselves dead. Sin cannot have dominion over you because you're not under law, you're under grace. Well, is the law bad? Absolutely not. It's holy, just, and good. And it's lawful to use the law if you use it lawfully. Paul said that. Going on real quickly. Would not have known sin except through the law, for I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. Now Paul knows he's a sinner because of the law of God. The people back before the flood, they didn't know that. We were proving something else the other night, that they were in Adam, that's why they died, but they didn't know that they didn't know sin the way we know sin. They were just as big as sinners, but there was no law that told them that. The law came in alongside. The law came in sideways. Later, 400 years after Abraham, the law came in to show the exceedingly sinfulness of sin. You would not know what a great sinner you are if the Bible doesn't say submit to one another. Just for instance. Verse 8, but sin, not the law, but sin, taking opportunity. Donald Gray Barnhouse says, through the Greek, that it is our basis of operation. Like in the Army, your base of operation. But sin, the base of operation, sin, taking opportunity by the commandment. You know what a fulcrum is? I guess we all know what a fulcrum is, don't we? You got something out here and you want to move it, and it's too heavy for you to move, so you get your big bar, the bigger the better. You put a block of wood or something down here, and you use that bar and that block of wood as the fulcrum, and you move it easily. That too is what's here, according to one of the writers I read. But sin taking opportunity, using the law as a fulcrum. That's just how terrible sin is. It'll take the holy law of God and use it against you. But sin taking opportunity by the commandment, by the law, thou shalt not covet, by the 10th commandment, the commandment, produced in me all manner of evil desire. It's not the law's fault. It's not God's fault. It's your fault. It's sin's fault. And that's what the law is there for, to show you how sinful you are. The law we all know this. We all know this. Everybody in the church, all churches know this, that we're justified by faith. That the law cannot justify. We all know that. What we don't understand is that the law cannot sanctify. And hardly anyone believes that. Our Reformed brothers, I would argue till dark concerning that. They'll agree in a minute. The law does not justify. And we all know that so clearly. But in our lives, in our everyday lives, we get to thinking sometime, because of all the avalanche of contrary teaching that's coming our way, we get to thinking that the law can sanctify. And the law cannot any more sanctify than it can justify. But sin, your sinfulness, you're such an evil, sinful person that the very law, the very holy law of God, the very standard that God has for all human beings, you take that and it causes you to sin even more. It's the power in your life. That's just how corrupt you are.
Larry, can I give you a story about the Roman Catholics?
Please do.
The Roman Catholics, of course, use, at least they did, use auricular confession to absolve people of their sins. But, in their historic past, what they really used it for many times was to seduce women.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did is they understood this principle perfectly. They were really quite brilliant. And what they would do is they would make suggestions to the women. Have you thought about this toward another man? And they would do that they used to go to confession, say, once a week after week, and they would go in great detail about some of these sordid things, you see, is what they really wanted to do with that woman, and seduce, tell them how many, and really probably millions.
Probably.
To the point that in Spain, there were so many of the children that looked like the priests, they actually went out and took a tax for that parish so they could actually pay for a harem for the priests would stop seducing the wives and the daughters.
I'll be.
That's just one example. It's been like that. But they used that concept that you're talking about to seduce women.
I'll be.
And all of us can be seduced by that. And in fact, the sex education, I think, is part of it. Go into this great detail and all this kind of,
It's only natural. Yeah.
I think that really, truly what they do by doing that is they cause lust then, and then put no morality to it.
Right.
They cause lust then with the young people whose hormones are raging anyway.
Right.
They cause the problem we're talking about right up there.
Absolutely. It's not the law's fault. It's your fault. It's the human being's fault. So as we go through this study, and as I plan on being here for a while, you hear me talk about the law, or Charles or anyone else, the evil, how awful it is to be legalistic, to be under the law. Don't think for a moment that we're bashing God's holy law. It is just that. It's holy. It's absolute holy. It's as holy as God, and it is the human standard. It is for every man. It's just that you're so sinful that when the law comes in and you put yourself under that law, then and you deal with that law and you confess that law and you confess the sin of breaking that law, and you're constantly with that law, and you're seeing your shortcomings and you're seeing your failures and you're seeing your successes all concerning that law, you're just way, way out of line. You're just as far out of line as you can be. It can only produce fruit of death. It can only produce death in you. We're going to see this more clearly next week. For apart from the law, at the end of verse 8, for apart from the law, sin was dead. So what should be our approach to God's holy law? And it is this, that we're dead to it. It has no authority over me whatsoever. Yes, it is a human standard, and yes, it convicts me of sin, but I am not going to be judged. That's why Romans 8:1, after we get through with Romans 7, Romans 8:1 says there's therefore now no condemnation. That's why it's got to be that way. But so I am not under the law of God. The law of God convicts me, yes, but I am holy, blameless, and beyond reproach. I am married to Jesus Christ. I am married to the risen Lord, and He is not under any kind of law, and I'm not under any kind of law. I don't care what kind of law it is to be judged by, or ruled by, or graded by. It's such a remarkable thought process that it's just almost unbelievable. It's just almost unbelievable that I am in that kind of a position. I'm married to Jesus Christ. He is my husband. I am his servant. I am his slave. And rather than being slave to sin, I'm now a slave to the risen Jesus Christ. And I bear fruit to God. It's so simple, but it's so amazing. So the law is good. The law is just. The law is holy. The law is blameless. It's sin in you taking opportunity through your sinfulness to misuse the law by either being convicted by being concerned with it. Let it do its job. And by the way, grace never fails. So if you whether you let it do its job or not, grace is still going to succeed. Okay, but the law will convict. The law convicts of sin. And what do we do with that sin? We do the very same thing that Paul does at the end of Romans 7. Go to Jesus Christ. And so the law does its work. We go to Christ when we reckon ourselves dead to the law and in the risen Christ. And that's the Christian life. That's the mature Christian life. That's what Romans 5, 6, and 7 is all about. So let's now next week we're going to see how this affected Paul personally. How this absolutely ruined his existence, at least at a particular moment in history, by putting himself back under that law. Well, let's have some coffee.